For the Woodsmith Shop TV show, we built this shop cabinet. One of the things we didn't get to in the episode was applying a finish to it. Now for shop projects, there's a whole range of options that you have, from doing nothing at all and just parking it in your workshop, to applying any of the finishes that you would use on a furniture project. And that's what we're going to show today. One of those is my favorite one, and it's Old Masters Master's Armor. It's a water-based product, and there's a few reasons that I like it. First is that it's fume-free and dries really fast. So I can put 3 coats on in less than a day pretty easily. The other thing that I like about it is that it's really durable, and I also like that on projects where I'm using lighter colored materials, like this Baltic birch plywood, it doesn't turn the plywood a harsh yellow color. It leaves it pretty light colored, and that's what I want in my workshop, something that's lighter and brighter. Now before applying the finish, the thing that you want to do is take care of your surface preparation, and that includes sanding. Now, I've already gone ahead and sanded the case sides and the top, and I have the doors here that I'm working on. Now, when you're working with plywood, most of the plywood's been machine sanded when it was manufactured to about 150 grit. So what I like to do is start with a random orbit sander and a 180 grit disc on here and just work all around the surface. Since you're already starting off with a panel that's pretty smooth and flat to begin with, sanding by machine won't take that long. Now remember, you're also working with relatively thin veneers, so you don't want to go crazy here either. Now a random orbit sander can still leave little barely noticeable swirl marks, but those can show up more once you apply a finish. So I always like to finish up by using a hand sander. This one has 180 grit paper on it, just like I finished up with, and working in the direction of the grain. Once you've finished with the hand sanding, we're just about ready to apply the finish. But what you want to do is grab a brush or your shop vacuum and get rid of all this dust on here, because we don't want it to contaminate our finish and make the whole process any harder than it has to be. There are several ways to apply a water-based finish, anything from foam brushes to paint pads. My preferred method is to use a synthetic bristle brush, something that has a relatively firm bristle. Before getting started, I soak it in a little bit of water. It's going to help clean up later on down the road, and it just makes the brush take up the finish a little easier, in my opinion. Now, after you thoroughly stir and mix the water-based finish in the can, I like to pour some out into a plastic deli container. It's just easier to be able to dip the brush in and out, and in between coats, I can just put the cover back on it and it's all ready to go without having to deal with the can anymore. Now, I've taken my 2 doors here and I've raised them up on painter's points, so that way I can get easy access to the edges of the doors, and I'm starting on the inside faces. So I can apply a coat of finish to the inside and then flip it over, and the painter's points aren't going to leave any marks on the inside face, and I can still keep moving along without having to wait for that surface to fully dry. Now when you go to apply the finish, I load up the brush, kind of tap off the excess, and then I start at one end, applying a band of finish, and then brushing it off the end. Then I can start working down the length of the panel. Load up the brush when you feel like it's starting to drag a little bit. Now, while water-based finish does dry pretty quickly, you do have plenty of time to be able to apply the finish to a surface as large as this without having to worry about creating any lap marks. If you end up with much larger surfaces, you do want to make sure that you keep going. Now, since I have the inside surface of the door finished, I can flip it over and to begin to apply finish on the outside. But for here, I'm going to begin with the edges. I still need to keep going here, but the water-based finish most of the time will dry in about an hour. I still have a little bit more to do here. In between coats, I like to keep the brush in a small cup with some water in it just to keep the bristles soft and the finish that's in the bristles from drying out. When I was a kid, we had read-along books that went with a cassette tape of somebody reading the book with you. And they always gave like a noise that would let you know when it was time to turn the page. For the books that I read, it was usually R2-D2. When it comes to knowing when to apply a second coat of finish on a water-based finish project, you can easily do that by taking some 320 grit sandpaper and wrapped around a block. When you sand across it and you get a white powdery residue that's left over, you know that the finish is dry enough to be able to sand it smooth and start to apply the second coat. So what I'm going to do is use that block and go over the entire surface. What I've discovered is that there are a couple of drips that came over when I was applying finish to the outside face of the door. Those are pretty gummy and tough to just sand away. So my usual solution instead is to grab a metal card scraper and you can scrape them smooth and then finish up with just a couple of passes of the sandpaper. Now it's gonna kind of feel like you've sanded away all of that first coat. But that first coat is really important. It seals the surface of the wood and establishes the foundation for building up the subsequent coats. Now before you can apply the second coat, you want to use a tack cloth and just wipe over the entire surface that you've sanded. Don't forget to take care of the edges, because you don't want any of that sanding powder to get lodged in the second coat. It's just going to make things harder. Now it's time to grab the brush and start working on that second coat. Since the first coat of finish sealed the surface, you're going to notice that you're going to use a lot less finish when you apply your subsequent coats, which is a good time to talk about applying finish to vertical surfaces like the case sides here. Most of the time, I prefer to apply finish on pieces that are horizontal, but sometimes, like in the case of this cart, it's just not possible. So what you want to do when you start to apply the finish is work the same way. I'm going to brush some across the top and work from the top down. It seems pretty obvious, but it's going to help me be able to track down any runs and drips as I go, and I don't have to worry about getting any finish on previously applied surfaces. You want to work in nice long strokes to avoid any lap marks or to create any bubbles or drips that can end up hardening and being tough to remove later on. The last thing that I want to do is look at it from like a low angle to make sure that I didn't leave any drips. And then just to slowly tip off the surface for an even coat. It's just after lunch and the second coat is dry on the cart. So we're ready to do the same thing that we did before. Second verse, same as the first. I'm still using that same sanding block. The 320 grit paper is worn down now from sanding the pretty tough resin that's in the water-based finish. Now when you're sanding the second coat, the strokes are extra light. What we just want to do is remove any of the dust nibs and keep a nice smooth surface. Then like before, we want to wipe down any of that dust so we don't contaminate our third coat. And we're ready to apply. And here's where using the Master's armor from Old Masters is really nice. Because it flows on so easily from the brush, I can get a lot of control for these last coats that build up the finish, and I know it's going to look great. All right, in about an hour we'll come back and wrap this up, and I'll show you how to finish off this finish. It's the middle of the afternoon and our third coat of finish is dry. Now how many coats of finish you apply kind of depends on what you want the look of the project to be. It's easy to want to stop after the second coat because it looks pretty good and you can feel the finish starting to build. But 3 coats, especially for a shop project, is where I like to be, especially since they dry so fast. But now that it's dry, there's one final step. You know, in between the other coats, we did some sanding, and I want to do that here, but I don't want to remove a lot of material. So my material of choice is to use some just regular grocery bag craft paper. I'm going to rub it all the way across the top. Rotate the faces. And it's kind of surprising, but the grocery bag craft paper is still abrasive enough to leave a little bit of sanding dust on there and to do the final smoothing without creating a lot of obvious sanding scratches. I did the doors and drawer fronts earlier, and you can see the difference between the sheen and the craft paper here, that it actually did remove material. So this cart's ready to be put to use. And if you're ready to try a fast drying, great looking finish, you might want to consider Old Masters Master Armor.